Hey there, welcome again to another video on books on world mythology. Today I'm going to talk about medieval epic and romance. I did a video there's a lot of books on medieval epic and romance, and I did a previous video just on Arthurian literature. And there's you could spend a lot of time doing many videos on epic and literature. Today I'm going to focus on a few more examples of that genre outside of Arthurian literature. But before I do that, I just want to mention a couple of books really briefly. This book is the first book I'm going to show you is a throwback to the Arthurian literature. I never mentioned anything about this book, which is an important part of the Arthurian cycle of stories. It's the story of Tristan and Isolde. Now, Sir Thomas Malory, in his Le Morte d'Arthur, does talk about Tristan and Isolde quite a bit, but it also has its own literature, its own stories. That's just on that is just on the romance of Tristan and Isolde. There's several of them. Perhaps the greatest, I think it's the greatest. It's this one. It's simply called Tristan, and it's by Gottfried von Strasberg. Early 13th century German, and it has a portion with the Tristan of Thomas. I believe what happened is I don't think I think he left it unfinished, so they have to take portions of of uh, of a work by Thomas to finish it up. This is put out by Penguin, and this translation is by Hato. And this is a great story of Tristan and Isolde, the tragic love story where Isolde is promised to somebody else, and Tristan and Isolde accidentally fall in love with each other because they drink a magic potion, and it leads to all kinds of problems. Okay, that's enough of that. Another book this is a throwback to my Celtic mythology video. I talked about various books on Celtic mythology. Then I talked about English translations of various important areas where you'll find Celtic myth. I gave some examples from Ireland, from Wales. I had one book from Scotland. I forgot about poor Brittany. This is a really great book, Legends and Romances of Brittany. Brittany is today part of modern day France, and Brittany itself means Little Britain, but today it's part of modern day France. And this particular book is by Lewis Spence, and it's an old book put out by Dover, and it's some great stories that just have to do with Brittany, including that famous story of the land that's sunk beneath the waves called Yes. Yeah, it's got that story too, and many others. Okay, so now let's get to the main thing I want to talk about. Um, we talked about Arthur in the last video, and King Arthur's, of course, there's a wealth of literature on him, but a lot of people don't know that there was another king that there's a tremendous amount of epic and romance built around him, and that's Charlemagne. Now, unlike King Arthur, Charlemagne, not only do we know he lived for sure, but we know a lot about what he did. We know when he lived. We know pretty much what he did in his campaigns. He basically went all over Europe, killing anybody that wasn't Christian. He did other things as well. He reformed education and did all kinds of stuff. But he did a lot of destruction too. He destroyed the Avars, which were this unusual civilization we know nothing about today because they were destroyed. He conquered the Lombards. Yeah, he did all kinds of things, but like with King Arthur, as time goes by, stories begin to develop around him, and he actually starts receding into the background, like King Arthur, and the heroes that come to the forefront are mainly his champions, just like King Arthur. In the literature, we get to hear a lot of times more about Lancelot and Gawain, and the same thing with Charlemagne. We hear more about Roland and Renaud and Oliver and Archbishop Turpin and all of these great heroes that are part of Charlemagne romance. Um, Perhaps now, in terms of epic as opposed to romance, there's a bit of a difference between the two. Epic, I believe, is bloodier. Bloodier. Romance has to do with stories where there's more enchantment. A knight goes into some magical realm, and there's more all kinds of ma- magic plays a role, and he rescues damsels and stuff. But in terms of great epic, there are there's this there's probably the greatest epic that comes out of epics having to do with Charlemagne is this book right here. It's called the Song of Roland. In French, it's something like Chanson de Roland. I don't know, my French is abysmal, but it means the Song of Rollins. And this is put out by Penguin Classics, and it's translated by Dorothy L. Sayers, and wonderful translation. And basically, this goes back to about the 13th century, and it's part of a series of stories about Charlemagne called the Songs of Deeds. Songs of Deeds, and this is the oldest and the greatest. And this Song of Deed is the Song of Roland, and basically, it's not a very long epic, but it's an amazing French epic. It's basically about how Charlemagne, his army, and Roland himself. Roland is the greatest champion, and they're all betrayed by one of their own to the King of Spain, and he tells them that when and where the Charlemagne's army is leaving. Charlemagne is on his way out of Spain, leading into France, and they're going through the Pyrenees Mountains, and basically, he tells the King of Spain where they're going to be and who's going to be in the rear guard and where their vulnerable points are, and it leads to great slaughter, unfortunately. And but keeping the rear guard of Charlemagne's army is Rollins, and he doesn't go down without a fight. I mean, he causes a lot of distress to the Spanish, to the Saracens, as they're called. Who are Muslim, and he causes all kinds of problems for them because he's such an amazing hero. But he really needs help, and his companions tell Roland, blow your horn, because he has this horn that could be heard from many miles away, and he could call for reinforcements. But being stubborn and being such a hero, he's got to do things honorably, and he thinks it's dishonorable to blow on his horn. He eventually does, but in order to find out if it's too late, you got to read the book. Okay, now I actually have Roland right here. I actually picked him up from my trip to France. There he is with his horn, and with this little sword. He said to me, "Take me to America." And okay, so that's how come he stays here now. Great epic. Now getting a little getting into other romances and other literature. There's a couple of really general books I want to share with you that I think are wonderful. These two books I'm going to show you have not only a lot of Charlemagne literature in it. They're basically shorter versions retold, but but they have other great literature too. But there's a lot of Charlemagne stuff in here. There's this book here, which one of my all-time favorites. It's a Myths and Legends series, and it's Middle Ages Myths and Legends. It's by H.A. Guerber. And this has all kinds of wonderful stories. It's got stories of Roland. It has stories of Renaud and he has this amazing horse called Bayard. It has stories of Juan of Bordeaux, who has a falling out with Charlemagne, and he's forced to go to the east on some suicide mission because he has this falling out with Charlemagne. But he befriends the king of the fairies, who's called Oberon, and I believe that Shakespeare used Oberon in Midsummer Night's Dream, and all kinds of wonderful stories is in this book, and I really recommend it if you like medieval romance, medieval literature in general. I have another book here that's kind of along the same lines. It's again a collection of stories that has to do with all kinds of stories of chivalry and knights, and it's called Romance and Legend of Chivalry. And again, another very old book. This one is it's again part of the Myths and Legends series, and it's by A.R. Hope Moncrieff. A.R. Hope Moncrieff. And again, it consists of stories of Arthur, stories of Charlemagne, and others. The others I'll get to in a minute. I have to get back to this book. Another really, really amazing book on the legends of Charlemagne is actually the third book of uh, Thomas Bulfinch's Mythology. Now, I mentioned his book Mythology in that video on Greece and Rome. Thomas Bulfinch wrote a book called Mythology, which has three parts. It has the Age of Fable. The second two books have to do with the Middle Ages. The second book is the Age of Chivalry, which is really good. But the one I want to talk about is his third book, which is Legends of Charlemagne, or sometimes it's called Charlemagne and his Paladins. And his paladins are basically like his knights. Now that third book I have, you could either get it bound with the other three books, or I have the special series, which is basically called the Illustrated Bulfinch's Mythology, and all three books are separate. They're all bound separately, and this is the third book, and it's Legends of Charlemagne, and this is a really nice. Really nice illustrated version. Yeah, it's got all kinds of great illustrations, and this book is absolutely insane because it's not very long, and Bulfinch uses many sources for this book. One group of sources that he uses is actually not medieval. It's actually early modern period. It's more from the 1500s. He uses various Italian authors who, sometime in Italy in the 1500s, there was this resurgence of Charlemagne literature, but it was a very different style. It was more burlesque, a little bit of parody, a little bit of comedy, fast action, over the top. It's like Charlemagne dialed to 11, and he uses those sources in this book, so the reading is very fast and fun, and it kind of gives you in just one little book so much of it. So yeah, so this is great. Another book that actually one of his main sources, one of Bulfinch's main sources that he used for this book is actually probably the greatest source, in terms of the Italian works on Charlemagne, is this book by Ludovico Ariosto, and it's called the Orlando Furioso, which is Italian for Orlando Mad or Furious Orlando. And so the author is Ariosto, and this is a pretty hefty book. This translation is in prose, very small print. It took me about a month to get through this book. This is by Oxford World's Classics, and this translation is by Guido Waldman. Guido, can you see it? Guido Waldman. And it was worth reading. It really was, even though it's huge. I mean, it's got comedy. It has great adventure. It's got a lot to do with Orlando is actually the Italian version of Roland. This guy, he's the Italian version of Roland, and Orlando in the story falls in love with this woman who doesn't really care for him. Her name is Angelica, and he's crazy in love with her. And when she marries somebody else, he goes insane. He loses it, and he basically runs around and starts, rooting up trees by the roots, because he's so strong and he's so crazy, and his friends want to try and restore his sanity. But it also tells the story of the love affair between the other hero, Ruggiero, and Bradamante. Bradamante is this cool woman warrior, and early on in this book, she defeats a sorcerer by the name of Atlas and steals his hippogriff. Yeah, you heard right, you Harry Potter fans out there. Hippogriff goes back before Harry Potter, and actually the mention of Hippogriff goes back to classical times, but Ariosto really uses him to great effect in this book, where the Hippogriff has a lot to do. So this book is a lot of fun. Okay, now moving out of Charlemagne and moving into I want to move into Spain now. Okay, we're moving from France into Spain. In this book that I held up earlier, Romance and Legend of Chivalry, he goes through three main areas: Arthurian, Charlemagne, and the last one is basically stories of Spain. And basically he talks a lot about, there's this great Spanish romance that is called Amadis of Gaul. Okay, and he spends a lot of time with that. Now, Amadis of Gaul, it's a very long work. It's in 4 books, and basically, it's one of the books that makes Don Quixote go crazy, because Don Quixote goes, in Cervantes' Don Quixote goes crazy because he reads too much literature on chivalry and he loses his mind. So part of I don't know if you read Don Quixote, but part of Don Quixote is his friends break into his house and burn all these books that made him crazy. But they don't burn the Amadas because they know that is the greatest. Okay, if you're going to keep any book, it's got to be the Amadas of Gaul. Now, there is an English version out there of all 4 books. I don't have a physical copy with me because I downloaded it on my Kindle. But here's the Amadas of Gaul, and the author is actually Garcia Rodriguez Garcia Rodriguez de Montalvo. Okay, his name is on the bottom, and the top is Amadis of Gaul. Now, Amadis is the main hero of the story, although there's others. And Gaul is, it's not really France. I know Gaul is associated with ancient France, but in this story, people think it may not be France. It's probably some other place, a smaller kingdom. Maybe it could be Wales, it could be a smaller kingdom, but basically, Amadis goes and serves this greater king in this greater realm called King Lisuarte, and he unfortunately falls in love with his daughter Oriana. And apparently he's not supposed to. It's a forbidden love, and he has a falling out with the king, and it leads to him roaming the world, conquering monsters and heroes, but he always keeps his beloved Oriana near his heart. In a lot of these stories, like in Charlemagne, in this story, the king sometimes is actually the bad guy. He's actually a bit of a dick, and the hero is actually the hero who's got to kind of make do with the fact that he has a big falling out with the king. But in this story, yeah, he always loves her from a distance. Oriana, on the other hand, she's she's the mushiest character I've ever come across in a romance. She seems to do nothing but cry and pine for her beloved, and she's jealous and whatever. But anyway, Amadas of Gaul is actually this is the public domain version. I'm sorry, I don't remember the translator, but it didn't cost anything. I don't think. I went to Kindle, I typed in Amadas of Gaul, and this is what I came up with. I read all 4 books. It's really long. There's shorter versions out there in English. If you look. So that's all I'm going to mention on Amadis for now. There is, getting back out of romance and getting back into epic. Spain has a great epic by the name of this one. You probably heard of El Cid. Sounds so much better in Spanish. There was a movie years ago with Charlton Heston called El Cid, but in this English version, it's Poem of the Cid. The Cid means like conqueror or lord or something to that effect. And this is a very important epic from Spain, and it tells the story of the Cid, who's here with a lion. He's so brave and strong. He has an encounter with a lion, and he's not even afraid. And the Cid was actually based on a real character who was involved with fighting Moors many years ago. His name was Rodrigo Diaz, and there's a lot of stories about El Cid. This book doesn't have all of them, but it's in one single edition is probably the greatest book about him, at least in terms of literature. It's partly a revenge story where his daughters are badly abused, and he takes revenge on the people who did it. So this is a good book. So basically that's all I have right now, except I want to mention one more book to you, one more romance that is not, in my opinion, it's not mentioned enough. It's I read this not that long ago. I downloaded it, so I don't have a physical copy. It's basically the story of, in English, she's called Melusina, and in this book, in this spelling, I think in the French version, I mean, this is a French romance. I think it's pronounced Melusine. I'm not sure. But in this English translation of the French romance, it's Melusine, or The Noble History of Lusignan. Okay? And Melusina is actually a legend that's associated with the city of Lusignan in France. And So we're getting out of Spain. We're going back to France, and she's basically a woman who is part serpent, part human. She's a fairy being, and she basically this is a sort of story that goes along the lines of Little Mermaid type story, where a guy, a normal human male, falls in love with some woman who is not quite human, and as long as he follows certain rules, they live happily for a while. They even have kids together. But then something goes wrong. The guy screws up as usual, and everything falls to ruin, and they have strange kids. They're brave, but they're strangely deformed. But this is a beautiful, beautiful story, and it's not mentioned enough in romances. And again, the story is simply Melusina, but the full name of this romance is Melusine, or the Noble History of Lusignan. They say that whenever somebody in Lusignan is about to die, she's still seen screaming and flying above the city. You could see her image here. She's bathing, and she's got the serpent's body and wings and a woman's upper body. And the romance is actually by a guy named Jean d'Arras. See his name? It's Jean d'Arras, and the translator of this particular book is Donald Maddox and Sarah Sturm Maddox. Let me make it a little bigger for you so you can see it. And the original author is Jean d'Arras, and this is a beautiful piece of romance. And okay, so that's all I have to say about medieval romance and epic for now. And with all this chopping of limbs and you know chivalry and what do you call that when they have the tournaments, the jousting, and remember, even if you're without your limbs, it's still just a flesh wound.